Hi, my name is Wafa, and today I'll tell you a little bit about Kenneth Koch and his book, The Art of the Possible, in this mini lecture titled Reimagining Comics as Poetry, or Poetry as Comics depending on your standpoint. To begin with, let me introduce to you Kenneth Koch. To give you the Wikipedia summary, he was an American poet, playwright, and professor who worked from the 1950s until 2002 when he passed at the age of 77. Kenneth wrote many poems and various essays, but perhaps the most remarkable thing about him is how he managed to reimagine the world of poetry and influence many that came after him. His famous essay, The Art of Poetry, published in 1975, gives us a sort of eagle-eyed view into his world of poetry. In a way, Kenneth Koch managed to both criticize the endless standards that come with what is defined as good poetry, all the while, ironically, telling us what he thinks is good poetry. Let me read to you some excerpts from his essay. To write a poem, perfect physical condition is desirable but not necessary. Keats wrote in poor health, as did D.H. Lawrence. A combination of disease and old age is an impediment to writing, but neither is alone, unless there is arteriosclerosis, that is, the hardening of the arteries, but that we shall count as a disease, accompanying old age and therefore a negative condition. Mental health is certainly not a necessity for the creation of poetic beauty, but a degree of it would seem to be, except in rare cases. Schizophrenic poetry tends to be loose, disjointed, uncritical of itself in some ways. Many have felt that this is problematic. A commentary on the appropriateness of physical and mental health when it comes to the arts is never a good sign. However, keep an open mind in order to see, perhaps, the irony or the satire behind his words. The specificity of the mentioned conditions is not random, after all. Here begins another excerpt. Quote, "Remember your obligation is to write, and in writing to be serious without being solemn, fresh without being cold, to be inclusive without being asinine, particular without being picky, feminine without being effeminate, masculine without being brutish, human while keeping all the animal graces you had inside the womb, and beast-like without being inhuman. Let your language be detectable as well, and fresh and true. Don't be conceited. Let your compassion guide you in your excitement, and always bring your endeavors to their end." End quote. Again, we see the irony of listing characteristics of what one should be in order to be a good poet. But look at the words themselves. They are not meant to guide. In my opinion, they are meant to show you a spectrum rather than a binary. You don't need to be feminine or effeminate. You can be anything in between, nor masculine or brutish. You can be whatever you want to be. And therefore, this is not really a list of what you should be, but rather what you could be or not be. The following lines end his essay. Quote, "It is true that good poetry is difficult to write. Poetry is an escape from anxiety and a source of it as well. On the whole, it seems to be worthwhile. At the end of a poem, one may be tempted to grow too universal, philosophical, and vague, or to bring in history or the sea, but one should not do that if one can possibly help it, since it makes each thing one writes sound like everything else, and poetry and life are not like that. Now I have said enough." End quote. Now I have said enough. Arguably, he has said too much. But that in itself is the point, isn't it? No words in the world of the art ever mean one thing, and to Koch, they are not meant to be definable on a single line. Koch took many approaches to creative writing and poetry. One of them was to teach it to both the elderly and the young, an unusual process given the differences in ages. Let's delve into the why of this process. Instead of explaining to you why, let's quote directly from the author himself. In his interview teaching poetry writing to the old and the ill, he gives us an insight into this process. Quote, "I found that I didn't feel bad about being with these people, that I wasn't worried about them. You know, I incline to worry about people one can help, but it's hard to know what to do in a room full of old and sick people. But it felt good about this poetry lesson. I liked teaching poetry and saw how they liked it. So I didn't have the unusual feeling of constraint, and I was interested in that. And that made me feel good because I was interested in how responsive they were." End quote. In a different section of the interview, he answers to what it means to instill a way of writing poetry. Quote, "Instilling, again, suggests that there is a preparation and then there is writing, whereas with my method of teaching, there is, in a certain sense, no preparation. All that happens from writing. I begin to give people confidence by having them write as soon as possible. You may begin to see here a recurrent theme of his contradictions. There is a process, but there is no process. There is a way to write, but there is no way to write. Good poetry exists, but it doesn't exist. And that's what's so unusual about Koch. He has a very different outlook on how to do things. Now that we understand a little bit about Kenneth Koch and his unusual way of doing things and his processes that are not really processes, let's finally look at The Art of the Possible, the book that was published post-mortem in 2004. Koch's book was once described as an influence to the visual and the literal. Here we can see some poems from his book The Art of the Possible. These poems are drawn out or written out in a different way that is presented visually. It is not an abstract or a concrete poem at all, but it is still poetry, written out in a different way that is not the lined, usual, orthodox way of writing poetry. Someone once said, "It is hardly a comic, yet a comic, and hardly a poem, yet a poem." Once again, the ironies and the contradictions of what it means to be a poet, what it means to write poetry, and how we can do it differently from now on. David Lemon's introductory note in The Art of the Possible gives us a sort of defined expression for how we feel about this new way of writing poetry. Quote, "The comic book, no less than the Elizabethan sonnet or the romantic ode, has its place in the world of seriousness and can provide the fodder or the structure, the spirit, or the form of a poem. The comic book panel was like the line in poetry, a unit of composition suggesting new ways of talking about things and dividing them up." End quote. New ways of talking about things and dividing them up. Dividing them up, when we think about poetry, when we think about comics, they are divided by panels, by lines, by stanzas, by images, by scenes, by parts of the story. It's just a different form. If you are interested to view more of Koch's poetry and comics, you can look them up on Amazon and have a look at his book. Instead, I want to present to you other artists that were inspired by his way of doing things, this new poetry genre. This is Harlequin from How to Be Everywhere by Warren Craghead. This is basically a poem, but written in a different way, where we can see a drawing that represents the story. Lines are not divided by stanzas, but by segments of the images. He says, "It also comes from my thoughts about how the lessons of Cubism can be applied to comics and narrative storytelling." In a way, Craghead is not only doing what Koch did by implementing poetry into comics, but he is also implementing art history and art culture into the way he presents his poetry. Another interesting comic poet inspired by Koch is Matt Madden, who wrote A Fine Mess, a book on 99 ways to tell a story, exercises in style. This one is called The Six Treasures of the Spiral, a comic sestina, in which not only the images are repeated in the way the sestina is, but so are the words, and thus form altogether a sestina comic, where both the images and the words follow the form of what it is to be a sestina. Madden actually took it a step further by creating other different genres, a comic without images, or a comic without text. What it means to be inspired by these kind of poetries and these kind of comics is that there is no limit to the creative arts of poetry. And thus ends our mini lecture on Kenneth Koch and his influence on the art of comic poetry, a new genre that we can expect to see more in the future. But the contradictions are hard to reconcile with sometimes. So think about these questions. Considering Koch's distaste for the way with which critics often disregard his work as serious or canon, why do you think he went towards comics, and even less seriously considered genre, with his follow-on publication? And how can we reconcile his strange directions in the art of poetry with his later interview in which he said that there is no directions? And third, a poetry that is not serious but an author that is fazed by the lack of serious consideration. How do you feel about Koch's poetry in regards to his sentiments about leaving a mark on the world? Let me know what you think. But remember, if we follow anything from Koch's work, is that there is no right or wrong, there is no serious or not serious. There is no real directions, even though he gives us directions. The answer is, there is no answer. We can just do things as we wish to do them and hope for serious consideration, or we can just do them and not hope for any consideration at all. The point is to be creative with what you do and enjoy it.